No worries. All right, we got a great panel for you today, guys. I guess it's really the theme of this conference is this intersection and bringing together these two individual areas and seeing where I think they come together and really have this synergistic effect on one another, and it's psychedelics and longevity. My name is Michael Brotherton. I'm the co-founder of Dragonfly 44 Capital, where we help to connect strategic capital to companies in the neuropsychiatric space. And then, confusingly, I am also the co-founder of a project called Dragonfly, without the 44. And we are designing a human optimization retreat where we have a license to legally administer psychedelics down in the Caribbean. And I really like this topic of human flourishing where psychedelics are involved, because we're really harnessing the power of psychedelics to change, to introduce new healthy habits and exercise more and sleep better and take care of ourselves. And it really has this synergistic effect with the benefits and mood-boosting capabilities of psychedelics. So they kind of work together, and I think it's the same way for psychedelics and longevity. And I think the two harnessed together really help us lead happier and healthier lives. So that being said, welcome to the panel, and I'm going to introduce my panelists. First, I have Toby Passman, founder and CEO of Neuroflex. I'll let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. So I'm a board-certified neurophysiologist. So I measure and train people's brain activity. So looking at the different brain waves, seeing how someone's brain is functioning on a biological level. And then I work with people dealing with different mental health issues. I've worked in a variety of different settings, such as for neurologists, mental health clinicians, substance abuse and rehab clinics. And now I'm really focused more in the peak performance space, but just utilizing different neurotechnologies along with some psychedelics to optimize human performance.
Next, we have Dr. Nicole Amata.
It's me. I'm Dr. Nicole Amata. My PhD is specialized in cognitive development throughout the lifespan with a specific focus on narrative self-functioning. So the meaning making that we do about ourselves, our relationship to other people in the world, as a constrainer or facilitator of adaptive development throughout the lifespan, and specifically drawing on the eudaimonic framework of well-being and integrating my background in neuroscience, doing electrophysiology and pharmacology on the endocannabinoid system in the rat hippocampus, then moved to EEG work on the attentional system, and then in my PhD work, developing a couple of scales, one on integration and the other one on narrative self-functioning that modeled adaptive self-referential cognition from the most minimal levels of body awareness and interoceptive awareness all the way up to existential self-representation and the adaptive meaning-making around existential resolve. I'm a coach, I'm an author, and a lecturer.
And finally, we have Dr. Holland Chen, who's been very busy today. I think this is his third panel in a row here. Love to hear your intro.
Great, thank you. Great to see everyone today. My background is in PM&R, which is sports medicine. So I'm double board certified. I also did interventional pain management. And a lot of my journey actually began on the whole road of, in medicine, I was seeing that we really weren't treating the underlying cause. A lot of it was just giving medications like opiates or doing procedures. And so on my journey, I really branched out into the regenerative medicine world. So I was working with stem cell therapies, things to boost the body's mitochondria system. And obviously that naturally leads to some components of psychedelics because it really revolves around what I consider there's a mindset of longevity and there's the actual structural, mechanical aspects in longevity, which is biohacking, peak performance, and physiology.
Great. So I think our first question kind of reflects some of your transition out, I guess transition through the medical field. What are some of the limitations of our current medical focus on disease, and how can a holistic and whole body approach that focuses on longevity and health span address some of these limitations?
Sure. I think the limitation in some of the way things are being treated, there's 2 to 3 reasons, right? Right? One, it could be a limitation in knowledge, right? A lot of medical disease or medical symptoms or the way the institutions are run is actually just symptom treatment, right? Versus real true disease management. And then it's a lack of integration between the multi-systems. So the psychiatrist might not talk to the person who's dealing with the endocrine disorder, but the endocrine disorder is actually majorly contributing to the psychiatric concerns. So that's one aspect. Two, the way medicine is traditionally practiced is very insurance-based. So there are things in the insurance model that say, hey, look, that's not covered, we're not going to do that. We will recommend you do this. So as a clinical provider, one of the reasons why we actually went concierge was that at one point, they were telling me that, oh no, you shouldn't treat that knee with an injection, you should do a knee replacement. I'm like, yeah, but you're kind of not here seeing the patient, so how would you know? And it's just based off of criteria. So I think that's really the hard part. And the third aspect is really the pace of innovation that's happening now in privately held companies versus like what I call more mainstream stuff. It's really slow. And so I think what happens is the innovation's happening so quickly, which is why we have conferences like this, which is why we see things very robust in the biohacking community, is that there's so much what I call self-care medicine. People have kind of taken it upon themselves to find out what's best for them. That's actually where I think the evolution is now going in healthcare.
Dr. Mata?
Yeah, so I definitely think there's been way too much emphasis on pathology and this assumption that if you're not experiencing negative symptoms, then you are healthy and optimally functioning. And there's a psychologist, Scott Kaufman, who developed the characteristics of self-actualization as a way to measure well-being that's not from a pathological model. And so I'm going to read some of these characteristics. The first one is continued freshness of appreciation, acceptance, authenticity, equanimity, purpose, truth-seeking, humanitarianism, peak experience, good moral intuition, and creative spirit. Who, by a show of hands, believes that their psychedelic experiences have increased or at least supported any of those subjective experiences? Yeah. So any psychiatry office, any diagnostician is not going to measure any of these qualities of optimal well-being. They're going to look at symptoms. And this is the major deficit of well-being in the clinical space.
So to add on to that, so psychiatry, Dr. Daniel Amen, psychiatrist and neuroscientist talks about that psychiatry is the only medical profession that doesn't actually examine the organ in which they're looking at or in which they're treating. You know, how bizarre is it that if you have an issue with your brain that you just go and, repeat whatever your symptoms are, you get labeled with a specific diagnosis and then put, on a specific one-size-fits-all treatment. So I think the fact that, so many people I think are walking around with, mental health disorders that I really think of in my work as more like brain health disorders. There's a book called Brain Energy, written by a Harvard psychiatrist that came out last year by Dr. Christopher Palmer, talking all about how, every different mental health disorder, anxiety, ADHD, depression, PTSD, there's all metabolic origins where the mitochondria within the brain are not functioning optimally, which is creating all of these psychological, psychiatric symptoms that you can't talk your way out of. So I think when it comes down to really addressing the root causes of some of these things that are fueling, the mental health epidemic that we have, and I think psychedelics is, something that can really get at a lot of the root cause. I think neurofeedback and other neurotechnologies can also play a role. So,
thank you, guys. So now, if you guys have been to any of the other drug development talks today, or I guess even visited some of these mushroom stands, you'll realize that psychedelics are being used to treat a number of different indications, and then people are talking about so many other things that they're helpful for. Why is it that psychedelics seem to be so transdiagnostically effective? And Nikki, I'll start with you.
I love this question. I think this is the most important question, honestly, because I think that this invites us to zoom out of the pathological model and really find the through point of healing and optimal well-being. And I think at the end of the day, when we look at the evolution of the brain, we look at the complexity of information processing in the brain, I think what we see is this unbelievable capacity for human beings to pause and make meaning and operate on that meaning. And everything in that meaning making is self-referential. And I think psychedelics target this self-referential system in the human brain and invite a kind of liberation from what has been adopted in the past, passively through internalization from our childhood, and give us an opportunity for a deeper pause, and invite us to explore our own meaning-making system that has been so ingrained in us and has been so passive.
Dr. Chen?
I think what's really interesting about that question is, there's a difference between like knowing something and believing it. And so I kind of, the way I look at psychedelics, it's creating that insight to have that belief now, right? And so a lot of people might call it spiritual leveling or fast jumping, but no matter how you view it, it's without the insight, I think that's where the healing occurs. And so I talk about how mindset affects your longevity. I think psychedelics actually create that early mindset for you, because a lot of times we have that disconnect within ourselves, and it's actually creating those neural connections and insight that we can actually take action on. And so for me, at least in my experience and also with the people I work with, a lot of their experience is actually just getting that internal connection, so that now what they actually cognitively know actually internally resonates as well. And that's what we call creates action, because without the action, it's good to know something, but you're actually not going to continue it.
And an internally directed action.
Yeah. Exactly.
Toby, you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I think a lot of mental health disorders have in common where people get into these ruts where it's thinking the same thoughts, doing the same behaviors, actions that become deeper and deeper ingrained the more that we do them. And I really love the analogy of the ski slope, when it comes to neuroplasticity, when we think about, the thinking the same thoughts, doing the same actions, as we grow up, as we develop, and then those become deeper and deeper ingrained, just like creating tracks down a mountain in which it becomes easier to go down those same tracks. But how I think about, psychedelics is kind of creating that fresh blanket of snow, allowing us to forge these new neural pathways going down the mountain and no longer think about ourselves or our place in the world in the same way that resulted in us falling into anxiety, depression, or other pathologies.
I think you brought up something really important here with the ski slope analogy, and it's neuroplasticity and neuroflexibility. I'm wondering how you guys view that these two abilities and benefits from psychedelics can be used to harness and create new habits that can lead to longevity, what the topic of this panel is about. And Toby, maybe we could start with you on this one.
Yeah, so what comes to mind is thinking about longevity when it comes to the brain. Alzheimer's is a huge thing as far as with neurodegeneration that they talk about. A lot of researchers are talking about Alzheimer's being type 3 diabetes, because there's such a strong blood sugar connection when there's been elevated glucose levels from chronic carbohydrate consumption, part of the Western, the standard American diet, that creates all of these problems within our whole health system, but especially as far as the brain goes with neurodegeneration. So I think when psychedelic experiences can create this awareness of what is going on in people's bodies, or maybe just an intuitive sense of knowing or figuring out how to actually implement plans to be healthier, plans to eat healthier, to exercise more, things that are going to really sustain your brain for the long haul, that are really the basics that aren't I guess the sexiest to talk about. Everyone is talking about the next nootropic and psychedelic, and I think when it comes down to it, being able to really just lay down the foundations of solid brain health, if someone can get there through a psychedelic experience and have the intuition that I need to cut down on my sugar consumption, and be able to actually follow through with that, I think can create a ton of long-term positive change for people's mental health and brain health.
Yeah, I do think that, so my bias is in meaning making, right, and expanding this pause. And so I do think that there's, these principles in neuroscience with neuroplasticity, if you don't use it, you lose it, neurons that fire together, wire together. And it's all about utilizing this opportunity, this window of malleability in this pause, to not take what is automatic as the truth, as the direction, but to pause and entertain possibility and sit with yourself and give yourself more of a kind of inclination to identify alternative pathways of thinking, of feeling, and of doing. And yeah, I think psychedelics map on in research with neuroplasticity. I think we see this in the actual neuroscience, and I think it's something we feel and can kind of intuit it from our psychedelic experiences.
Yep. I look at this. I think psychedelics will go down the road of some sort of pharmaceutical compound, right? Because at the end of the day, if you look at what happened in the cannabis industry, very little was known about the endocannabinoid system, but now we know so much about what we do for pain management, appetite, and whatnot. I mean, if this was so readily available, we would actually probably find out what neural connections it could create, what it could do for longevity, because it's basically an undefined, or let's say relatively narrowly defined field that actually has not had a lot of research to discover which receptors work. I mean, there are hundreds of different strains of psilocybin that could probably be engineered or modified. So I think what we're going to see is that this one, unlike the cannabis industry, I think will have a much more clear pathway from a pharmaceutical standpoint, because you're actually targeting things like PTSD, anxiety, trauma. There's a lot more implication and wide-brain uses of it. And because it also has that performance aspect, I think that will actually be one of the big things in biotech that will come because of that.
Yeah, fully agree. All right. Since we're talking about longevity, one of the topics I want to touch upon is chronic stress and just how increased cortisol levels and inflammation can contribute to the acceleration of aging and also contribute to age-related cognitive decline and the development of neurodegenerative diseases. How can psychedelics be harnessed to reduce chronic stress and develop a longevity-focused lifestyle? Dr. Chen?
Stress less that. No, I mean, I think it's a large part of again, I kind of bring it down to what is the insight, right? And so when you kind of think about what your psychedelic experience, if you had or had not had one, it's really about bringing that insight. And so like anything like a therapeutic, I think a better example would be this. Look at antidepressants, right? Antidepressants don't really, they help people who are depressed, but how many people do we know who are antidepressants are still depressed, right? And so when you're kind of looking at how can psychedelics reduce stress, it's really about awareness, right? And so we actually are trying to actually discover now, what do psychedelics do? And I think from a biological standpoint, they're bringing in more of a balance, whether or not it's a serotonin versus dopamine balance. There's something that physiologically is changing, right? Which is why some people have those profound moments where they have trauma, and then let's say they have a resolution of that phase, they don't have it. So I think the way that stress works in the body, stress is basically unrealized or unresolved trauma, or how you handle your emotions. So I think with psychedelic experiences, it helps people fast track that acceleration of the emotional processing, or even give them tools, right? Some people don't have the awareness because there's just not enough insight, and maybe that insight is a lack of dopamine or lack of serotonin or lack of norepinephrine. Whatever it's doing, there's that fast track. So I think from terms of stress, I think the stress reduction comes because the body's actually able to process the thoughts, feelings, and emotions much better.
Who here has felt anxiety or stress related to their sense of self, perceived sense of self within yourself, or the perception of other people? Yeah. So again, I come back to targeting the self-referential system. I do think building reference points of liberating yourself phenomenologically from the meaning making that has happened around your sense of self in your lifespan is incredibly adaptive. And I think the more we build on those reference points and cultivate a sense of autonomy and choice in how we interpret ourselves, others, our relationship to the world, can absolutely mitigate the automatic kind of anxiety and stress that comes with being a self in the world.
I think when it comes to looking at the brain, on an electrophysiological level, a super common finding that I see, I do brain scans and measuring people's brain waves, you see a lot of excess high beta brainwave activity. So high beta is that state, kind of mental excitation, excitement, but also agitation, that kind of chronic fight or flight response. And I see a lot of executives, high performers that I work with who are kind of stuck in that state. Now, usually those people are very highly productive, motivated. There's a lot of benefits to kind of being in that very driven state, but that also can really burn out the nervous system. And we know that as far as chronic stress shrinking the hippocampus, the area of the brain really important for learning and memory, something that a technology or modality such as meditation can really reverse some of those changes and boost blood flow to different areas of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, that is really helpful in terms of our emotional regulation and being more resilient in terms of handling the stress that we might face. I think it really is a matter of not just trying to get away from the stress, even though, like looking at the brain waves of, Tibetan monks like in the Himalayas who are doing hours and hours of meditation a day, their brain waves, we can learn a lot from that, even though we don't have to go out and live like that. We can see significant elevations in a certain brainwave called gamma, which really facilitates neuroplasticity. So a lot of psychedelics will enhance gamma waves in the brain, as does many forms of breath work, meditation. So we can kind of harness what we know, about the brain on an electrical level with all these different modalities to get us out of that high beta state into some of these slower beneficial brain waves that are calming for the nervous system. And when you get into those slower brain waves, when the brain slows down, then it also triggers the release of those super fast gamma waves that really facilitate, these new neural connections and neuroplasticity in action there.
Okay, next one. How does the quality of social connections and support systems influence longevity and health span? And how can psychedelics be used to harness to increase the quality of these social connections? Dr. Chen.
Sure. So there was actually a pretty well-known Harvard study. It was an 85-year study, right? So 8 decades, they followed these patients, and essentially they said the number one determination of people's longevity, health, happiness was positive relationships. And so I think when you really think about how can psychedelics influence your relationship, it's the relationship with yourself, right? If you have a better relationship with yourself, you have the insights, you do the work, there are things that you work on, whether it's your anxiety, your depression, or things that you're anxious about, or even other things that you don't have insight on. One, you'll have a positive relationship with yourself, and then two, that affects the relationships you have with others, because if you show up to the table, you're more grounded, you're more mindful, the things that you actually do make you a better person to actually be around, not just in romantic relationships, but family and friendship. Those are all the things that cultivate longevity, because really, amongst, at least with this study, they said positive relationships was the number one factor for having good health.
Yeah, this is where I think the ego dissolution experience really comes into play, that these reference points that psychedelics give us of liberating outside of the self, even in Maslow's work of self-actualization, towards the end of his life, he really identified that self-actualization is maybe a kind of precursor to self-transcendence or finding, which is not self-neglect, by the way. Self-transcendence is, this kind of really bigger picture, kind of communal feeling with humanity, and liberating yourself from that immediate biological stress and anxiety with being a self. Everything is filtered through the self-referential system. And so to have this ability to come outside of that and really fully embody what your sense of purpose is relative to other people and the world, I think is that bigger picture existential framework that mitigates deep levels of anxiety around purpose and value. And so I think psychedelics can really help us cultivate that big picture perspective and ground ourselves in what is my purpose relative to other human beings in the world.
I think that, it's no coincidence that during the pandemic, social isolation rose, as did all of these different mental health conditions, as well as, with psychedelics. I think that really took off of people, seeing that, they could utilize these modalities for, for the social isolation, or just realizing the importance of the social connection for having a healthy brain. I think looking at certain studies of what MAPS has done with MDMA, measuring social anxiety in adults with autism and showing, significant improvements. And I think that is something, personally dealing with a lot of social anxiety growing up, MDMA was hugely beneficial in just getting rid of my own, negative self-talk or self-image and being able to actually connect with people on a more authentic and real way. So I think that, people being able to utilize tools like that, can really foster way deeper relationships, connections. I think it starts with, that connection with yourself, but then having a healthier connection with yourself, then being able to have healthier connections with everyone around you and deeper and more authentic connections too.
All right, we have a couple minutes left, so I have one last final question here. What is your vision for the future of psychedelics in the field of longevity, and what steps need to be taken to achieve that vision? Toby, we'll start with you this time.
I mean, I guess my bias is, seeing more results or more brain mapping. I've done some different measurements looking at the electrophysiological changes with psychedelics, and looking at the literature, there's a lot of mixed evidence where you'll see certain studies saying that ketamine decreases theta at the prefrontal cortex, and other studies saying the opposite. So I think, just on a neuroscience level, having a much deeper and better understanding of how these compounds affect the brain on a physiological level, just from my standpoint, I think it's going to be really interesting in terms of being able to utilize this as a modality in addition to the existing neurotechnologies I already work with, and things like nutrition, meditation, supplementation, seeing how we can create, a customized, unique protocol for each person's neurophysiology, I think based on the psychedelic. I think knowing which psychedelic is going to be best for a certain person or what dosage is going to be best, I think being able to, have that really precise approach, like precision medicine has taken off. So I think like precision psychedelic medicine will be super cool in the future.
Thank you. Nikki?
So I think I have a little bit of a different take here. I am surprised that we have so much intersection of longevity and psychedelics and not that much mention or attention or investment into death and dying and palliative care. And I think psychedelics are an incredible tool for resolving existential dread and anxiety. And I would hope that the future of longevity and psychedelics really incorporates the care around death and dying and the acceptance and confrontation with this as an inevitable part of life, and not so much the white knuckle grip to life, but more so the answering the question that death asks of us, and confronting grief asks of us, which is surrender. And I think that's the population, and no matter how much control striving we do around life, it's inevitable and a part of life, and I would hope that there would be much more attention on that. We lost a pioneer of the psychedelic industry, Roland Griffiths, in the past 3 weeks, and he did this amazing interview with the New York Times about what this diagnosis did for him and his life. And he invites us all to confront our existential condition and work with that as a strength for finding purpose, finding presence, and finding gratitude.
Thank you. Dr. Chen?
Sure. I think it's actually three things, right? So when we take the word longevity, I think the differentiating thing is really about health span, because longevity in the conventional sense means I'm going to live longer, right? But health span actually accounts for the actual quality of years. And so what is psychedelics really doing for people? I'm assuming the presumption is that it's increasing the quality of your life, right? So maybe you don't live longer than 95 years old, but up until 95, 94, you're a happy person, super productive, and your comorbidities or other health diseases are relatively at bay. I think that's where psychedelics can really make a difference for people, right? I think it's really about creating that healthy, positive framework and getting people to that point where they do feel good about things. The second aspect, let's take it into actually more the performance side. I think psychedelics could heavily influence how your body actually changes and performs. So there's a thing called methylation. Your DNA gets turned on or off by environmental factors. So if psychedelics actually produce this external environment for you to actually experience more things, better things, you actually might see there's actually increase in genetic expression of things in your body that will actually be more adaptive, more resilient, and live longer. And then on the third thing, even though not longevity related, but pretty much tied in, we do some things where we work with some clients for addiction. It's a little off topic, but addiction is a real super big thing nowadays. And I think psychedelic medicine could quite help with a lot of that because, it's hard to address like the future of health without addressing the fact that addiction is such a poorly conventionally treated thing, right? Most people go into addiction programs. Most addiction centers are run by former addicts. Nothing wrong with that, right? But it's just the way that conventional medicine treats it. It's just putting more drugs on a drug situation. Whereas I view psychedelics is more, even though it's not a drug per se, it's a medical way to treat something that could bring that insight. Because addiction's a lot, both physiological and obviously how you feel. And so I think it's probably a big component missing. And so many people who have shorter lives are probably suffering from things that are addiction related.
All right. Thank
Show
you to all of our
some love
speakers.
to these